Put my gin over here.
Perfect. Good evening. My name is Naomi Krogman, and I am the Dean of the Faculty of Environment at Simon Fraser University. I welcome you here tonight for the third talk in our 2020 lecture series, and this talk is entitled How Red Zones Punish the Poor, Generate Crime, and Break the Law. I begin by acknowledging that we are on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations. Rudy Reimer, one of our archaeology faculty members, also a member of the Squamish Nation, said he would actually prefer that we do the acknowledgement differently, where when we start a ceremony such as this, we actually say, what is our purpose? So I would say our purpose tonight is to learn from Nick Blomley and Anne Livingston about how the lived and often hidden experience of some of Vancouver's most vulnerable population warrants our attention. We are really fortunate to have these two with us tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about both of them. Nick Blomley is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the nation's most distinguished council of scholars. He's also a professor in our Department of Geography. He has a long-standing interest in legal geography, particularly in relation to property. Much of his research concerns the oppressive effects of legal relations on marginalized and oppressed people. Examples include the study of court-imposed red zones on street-involved people, precarious housing conditions in Vancouver's most vulnerable population, and the governance of poor people's possessions by private and public regulators. Anne Livingston is a passionate community activist working to promote harm reduction and the rights of people who use drugs across British Columbia. She is currently working with the BC Yukon Association of Drug War Survivors, who provide funding and support to seed drug users groups across BC. She co-founded the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users in 1998, where she encouraged people who use drugs, who are criminalized and labeled mentally ill, to form citizen associations to help design and implement harm reduction programs. I now turn this over to Nick.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Naomi. It's great to be here. I also would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the stolen lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. I'd like to thank Dean Krogman for inviting me to participate in this really important series. I attended the previous two, and they were fantastic. I hope we can continue that tonight. I also want to thank Anne Livingston, who's going to provide some commentary on my presentation, which I hope will be fairly brief. Anne is a phenomenal activist. They should name a street after her. I think that's my new campaign, the Anne Livingston Street. This project is also not my project. It's a project that is headed up by a phenomenal scholar, Marie-Ève Sylvestre, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. So she was the, what we call principal investigator for this research project. She headed it up. I also collaborated in this project with another wonderful scholar, Céline Belot, who teaches in the School of Social Work at the Université de Montréal. I'll be talking about the Vancouver component of this project, and we benefited greatly from some collaborations with some other groups, including VANDU, the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, which Anne helped create, a group called Pivot Legal, which does phenomenal advocacy work on behalf of marginalized people, a group called Hustle, which works on behalf of men in the sex trade, as well as some legal and judicial actors. And the title of the talk here is How Red Zones Punish the Poor, Generate Crime, and Break the Law. And so that's actually what I'm going to be talking about. So if you've seen the slide, you can basically go home now. But I'll try and unpack that a little bit for you. And I just want to note that we've just literally about 3 weeks ago got a book out by Cambridge, which we're very proud of, called Red Zones, published by Cambridge, which you're welcome to access. If you don't have access to that, we also have a report here, which is online and it's freely available as a PDF. You're welcome to contact me and I can give you a copy of that, and that summarizes the Vancouver component of this project. So let me talk a little bit about the project. What we're interested in is something called conditions of release. Conditions of release entail a legal process in which a person who's detained, who's held in prison or on remand, is released with conditions imposed by some legal actor, usually a judge, could be a police officer. These are associated in particular with bail, which I'll focus on today, probation, and also something called conditional sentence orders. Our focus was on conditions of release that had geographic or spatial dimensions associated with them. One of the most important that we'll talk about is the red zone. A red zone is a zone of exclusion, an area, a city block, for example, or it could be an entire city from which a person, as a part of their condition, is excluded from. It can also include no-go orders, which are like very small red zones where a person is not able to go to a particular location, a store, for example, or a place at which their partner resides, but also things like non-association. This is the requirement that people do not associate with other people, maybe who use drugs or people who are part of some larger roundup, in the case of protesters, for example, and also curfews, which are a time-specific red zone. Essentially, you can't be outside during overnight. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that these are immensely important phenomena. When we started the project, there was basically very, very little research on this topic. People in places like the downtown east side know an awful lot about red zones, but people outside places like the downtown east side know very little. And that was really our job in this project. So we took a very deep dive and generated lots of data. So that's what this slide is trying to communicate. It's a very robust analysis. We have a whole load of data, qualitative and quantitative, on which we are basing our arguments. We focused in particular on Montreal and also the city of Vancouver, which I'll be talking about here. But we also dipped into Toronto and Ottawa. We did a bunch of interviews, or our research assistants who did some phenomenal work, did some many interviews with people subject to these conditions, and I'll explain them for you quite soon. People in particular who use drugs, people in the sex trade, also demonstrators, which I won't be talking about here. That's another section of the project. As well as interviews with judicial actors, with court actors, judges, defense counsel, prosecutors, and so on. The Vancouver Police Department declined our request that we speak to them, which is unfortunate. We also did a whole bunch of observations in courts, watching bail hearings and so on. And we also were able to obtain some very large data sets, criminal justice data sets, around conditions of release, comprising about 1 million conditions, so very, very large bundle of data. So our focus includes conditional sentence orders and probation, but I'm going to focus on bail. I focus on bail because of its significance to the data set. About 60% of all the cases in the Vancouver data set entailed bail. Bail, just to remind you, if you're not entangled in the criminal justice system, bail is the legal process whereby you may be arrested for something, you're detained, you're held maybe in remand, and then you go before maybe a court, and the court releases you with certain conditions. There are two types of bail. There's police bail, so police can release people after an arrest at the police station, and court bail, which is the process I just described, where a person is released after having been detained in remand overnight, maybe, or for a couple of days. Now, it's important to note just, and this is fundamental, that when we're talking about bail, the presumption of innocence applies, right? You have yet to be found guilty of that offence. You have to come before the court at some future date at which your guilt or innocence will be determined. That's one point we should note. We should also note that because bail is attached to a court order, it's legally consequential. It's not just a suggestion from the court, it's a legal order. Violation of a condition, or breach of a condition, as it's also called, is a criminal offence. It's what's called an administration of justice offence. We'll come back to that one in a minute, with very serious consequences. You can be detained in remand and so forth. Bail conditions increasingly involve spatial conditions, including red zones, and that's clear in the study. I'm also going to suggest that conditions, including red zones, are used heavily in relation to alleged drug offences. Important also to note that these conditions are not generic. They're supposedly tailored to the individual. So the individual comes before the court, the individual determines where that person lives, whether they're working, and so on, and then is supposed to craft a condition, a bail order, that meets their needs. We also need to distinguish this from the American context. In the US, we talk about cash bail or money bail, where people have to pay a lot of money. That doesn't really apply in this context. It does apply to some extent, but not to the same degree. That's a different kettle of fish. So here's a sort of sample bail order. This could be in the case of PPT, possession for the purposes of trafficking. This is actually a real bail order for a person. You'll usually find something like this: keep the peace and be of good behavior, which is actually kind of a big category when you start unpacking it, but we can get into that. Not to possess any weapons, not to possess drug paraphernalia except at your place of residence or maybe in a safe injection site. And here's a red zone: not to be within the 100 block of East Hastings in the city of Vancouver, including adjacent laneways. And here it's been tailored. You can go to the Carnegie Centre because there are resources there, but you have to go via Main Street. So that's a kind of very conventional, routine bail order. And as you can see there, we have the red zone. Now, to most of us, outside places like the downtown east side, red zones are invisible. I suspect many of you may have not even heard of red zones. But to places like the downtown east side and to communities there, they are ubiquitous. They are omnipresent, they are overlapping, they are deeply entangling as well. So, what do the big numbers tell us? We've got that big data set. The data set was for all adult criminal court cases in Vancouver that entailed conditions of release between 2005 and 2012. It's a big data set. It's about 30,000 people. There's about 100 orders, and there's, of those orders, about 500,000 conditions. So, 5 conditions per bail order. We also have data from Montreal, which kind of align more or less with the Vancouver data. So there's our data set there. So just to summarize, what this slide is telling us is a couple of things. Firstly, there are loads of conditions. Lots and lots of bail orders have conditions attached to them. They're also heavily used in relation to drug offences or alleged drug offences, where red zones are also common. And those red zones also seem to generate lots and lots of breaches. So that's the big picture we're looking for here. So let's just drill down very quickly. So 97% of all bail orders in Vancouver include some conditions of release. Now, jumping ahead, we should note that this is actually contrary to the criminal code. The criminal code presumes unconditional release. The default is unconditional release, no conditions at all. But only, 3% of our bail orders actually had no conditions attached to them. In many cases, they had multiple conditions in some cases. And those conditions were in place for long periods of time, 6 months, a year in some cases. Of all the conditions, spatial conditions of release, things like red zones, no-goes, non-communication conditions, they comprise nearly half of all the conditions, so they're a big deal. Red zones seem to be mostly imposed in the context of drug and violence offences or alleged violence offences. 53%, so half of all bail orders associated with drug offences included a red zone. Right? So red zones are common, and they're common particularly in relation to things like drugs. Red zones also generate numerous breaches. And this is a thread I'm going to come back to. People breach their conditions in a routine and ongoing fashion. So that's another important thread we need to attend to. And statistically, we did some modeling. I didn't, but my people who knew better than I did. We determined that the more conditions you had, the longer you had those conditions, the likelihood, the increased likelihood there was that you were going to breach your court case, your conditions. So who's subject to these conditions? Conditions of release, including red zones, are extensively used to govern criminalized and marginalized people, including people who use drugs and people in the sex trade. And this becomes evident when we do a bit of geography. I had a wonderful master's student, Will Damon, who Anne knows. Will took a 1-month slice of that criminal justice data set and mapped all the red zones. This is quite a big job. He mapped all the red zones. This shows us the geography of red zones in Vancouver. It's what you might call a heat map. So the hotter the color, the higher the color, the greater the number of red zones. And clearly, the downtown east side has a significant proportion, in fact, 37% of all the red zones in Vancouver in the downtown east side. And 92% of all drug offense-related red zones were in the downtown east side. So that's given us some context. Let's try and think more generally about the arguments I want to make. The first argument being the claim that red zones punish the poor. Conditions of release are most present amongst marginalized and criminalized people engaged in survival sex or the street drug trade. As such, they are frequently experienced by poor people. Red zones, in that sense, I'm going to suggest, punish the poor, which is not what they're supposed to do. According to the legal actors we spoke to, red zones are useful, pragmatic tools. They were seen as keeping people away from criminal spaces, allowing them to make good choices in a tricky environment. But the people we talked to were very, very clear. Those governed by them saw them, at best, as arbitrary, perplexing, and counterproductive. At worst, they were seen as cataclysmic, violent forms of legal action, separating people from valued resources, valued networks, and valued people. People described being severed from the ongoing life of a place, like the downtown east side, causing deep emotional harm, displacement, and inability to access resources. So here's someone we'll call Sarah. She was red zoned from Burnaby. She was then red zoned from New West, and now she's in the downtown east side. So red zoned from entire cities. For her, that experience was shitty, because that was my life, those places. That's where I knew everybody. That's my everyday life. That's where I live. A woman we'll call Lisa. She described being red zoned, as she put it, from all of Hastings Street, while on bail for possession for purposes of trafficking. Noting that for her, it didn't make sense. My bank was there, my home was there, my probation was there, my doctor was there. Come on, guys, all of Hastings Street. Hello, my whole life is there. They're going to arrest you every time you want to go home. Now, you're not supposed to red zone people from their homes. We found evidence that people were being red zoned from their homes, or being red zoned from places which caused them to become homeless as a consequence of that process. It's also clear that red zones not only punish the poor, but they also force people into risky places. They place already precarious people into spaces and conditions that make them more precarious. Women in the sex trade in Ottawa described being forced to access sketchier locations because they were red zoned from their normal places of business. People who were detained when they were breached, so you breach, you were held in remand, described how devastating that could be, particularly for people who use drugs. Conditions placed criminalized people into riskier relations with the police. They became more visible and described often the way in which that led to violence, to shakedowns, and precarious relations. It also proved very difficult for people to access needed resources, accessing food, accessing safe injection sites, amplifying their own health problems. The example I want to give you, and it's a very challenging one, is a man we'll call Clyde. So Clyde was arrested for a curfew in Vancouver that he was unaware of. This isn't common. This is quite common. People don't actually know their conditions, or they forget their conditions, or they're simply unaware of what those conditions actually comprise. So he's arrested. He was then charged with assault on a police officer. He claimed that the police assaulted him. He was then held in remand for 5 months. He was bailed out with a curfew. As a consequence of that, he was unable to access housing. He was obliged to couch surf. While couch surfing, he developed a staph infection from bedbug bites. As a consequence, he was obliged to attend hospital, St. Paul's, I'm assuming, every 12 hours for IV antibiotics. This is what happened. I'm on curfew. It's 5 minutes to 10. His curfew is at 10. And I'm going to rip the IV because of his curfew. There are police outside his hospital room. The doctor knows what's going on. He goes into the lobby and talks to the officers, tells them what's going on. And the doctor said, I don't care about his conditions. This is him to the police. He has to come into the hospital every 12 hours. What did the cops do? Well, they documented it. And the moment I was done with my IV antibiotics, they arrested me and breached me 8 counts. And I did 5 months. Addiction was a common thread, and the challenges associated with addiction in relation to these conditions, in particular red zones. Now, legal actors, as I noted, saw red zones as actually a useful resource, a way, as one legal actor put it, of keeping people away from the, quote, drug scene. It's rehabilitative in the sense that you're keeping them away from where the influences are, the negative influences on them. This is kind of a rational choice model, right, where stay away from the bad things, go to the good things, and all will be good. Those people subject to them, particularly those who use drugs, were much more realistic. They recognized that addiction entails a dependency not only to drugs, but to a place, the downtown east side. Addiction isn't a choice, but was characterized as a form of self-medication for people dealing with trauma. In other words, red zones are penalizing people for their ill health, placing people in an impossible situation. Here's a man we'll call Patrick. The court will give you a red zone, so you can't come into this area. But I'm an addict. They sell drugs in that area. So in order for me to get drugs, I have to go to that area. Duh. So even if the court tells me not to, I still go, because I have to, even if the court tells me not to. Samuel argued that the only effect of a red zone in the downtown east side in this context is to, quote, ensure that a person is going to come back through jail on a new charge because of the predictable effects of addiction. It's part of a pathway that puts people back in jail. And this is another common thread. Red zones are part of a carceral continuum, a cycle in which people get more and more embedded. And we can see this when we get to my second point. Red zones generate crime. This seems counterintuitive. People breach their conditions. They breach their conditions, including their red zones, for obvious and predictable reasons. They need to access resources and emotional and familial networks that they've been banished from. People also are willing to accept unrealistic conditions because they want to get out of remand. Remand is a very bad place. Prison is a bad place. Remand is an even worse place to be. So people in remand, particularly people who need access to drugs, will accept conditions that are simply unrealistic and then find themselves in conditions that they simply cannot sustain. People also breach their conditions because they're often hard to interpret on the ground. They don't know where the red zone actually is. What does the 100 block of Hastings Street actually look like? Breaches then generate more restrictive conditions. The court throws the book at you. Restrictive conditions which are even more unsustainable, which then, not surprisingly, generate more breaches. Now, a violation of a court order, of a condition in this case, is a criminal code offense. It's a crime. It's a crime because it's part of a court order. It's an offense that exists because it threatens the authority of the court. And it's clear that loads and loads of people are breaching their conditions on a routine, everyday basis. Let me give you some stats. This is for 2011 to 2012. These are the list of criminal code offenses for all of Canada by percentage, like break and enter, drug possession, weapons, major assault, fraud, theft. The top two are failure to comply with an order, which is breach of bail, and failure of breach of probation. Those are the top two criminal code offenses in Canada. More people in Canada are held in remand than are held in prison after a finding of guilt. Total criminal code violations have gone down. Crime has gone down statistically. 23% between 2007 and 2017. It's gone down a quarter. Administration of justice violations, breach of bail, breach of probation, have gone up 8% in the same period. We estimate that almost a quarter of all criminal cases for at least a decade have been administration of justice offences. Almost a quarter of all criminal crimes, statistically speaking, are AOJ offences. They're manufactured crime in that sense. It's not an offence to walk down the 100 block of Hastings Street. It's only an offence when the court says this is a condition of your release that you can't be walking down Hastings Street. 40% of BC criminal cases include an administration of justice charge. And sometimes it's the only charge. This is insane. A huge population of people then appear to be governed by these conditions of release. And given the dominance of racialized people who are criminalized, we can anticipate that AOJ offenses fall heavily on people of color, notably Indigenous people. So rather than a stepping stone allowing for personal advancement, which is the way you might think about bail, conditions of release are too often effectively a revolving door. Revolving door, this is the phrase we used in our book, and it's actually not the best metaphor. If it is a revolving door, it's a door that gets smaller and smaller and harder to find because the conditions get more and more oppressive. Now, while some of these AOJ offenses may make sense, like, for example, a person who breaches a no-go order excluding them from the home of a person that they've allegedly been violent to, most of these, as I said, are indeed forms of manufactured crime. They're crimes constructed by the workings of the criminal justice system. Collectively, they represent a phenomenal cost, a phenomenal social cost, a phenomenal financial cost, if you're interested in that as well. 2009, it was estimated that AOJ offences, administration of justice offences, alone cost about $700 million. So in 1 year, $700 million of our money, which could have been spent far more intelligently, was spent on locking up people and penalizing people who were unable to meet their conditions. And what's interesting is the criminal justice system can't quite see this. The legal actors we spoke to were kind of puzzled. As one put it, where did all the real criminals go? All I see in my courtroom is breach, breach, breach. Where did all the bad guys go? So there's this disconnect quite clearly that this person is struggling with. Okay, third point. Red zones break the law. Particularly in relation to bail, red zones and other conditions frequently violate criminal law and the constitutional rights of those subject to them. The Canadian Charter, the highest law in the land, provides that any person who's charged with an offence has the right not to be denied reasonable bail without just cause. It's your right to be released, unless there's some compelling reason. Courts and police, in other words, have a duty to release at the earliest possibility, given the presumption of innocence, right? You haven't been found guilty yet. If you impose conditions, and they are optional, they're not required, they must be justified and they must be reasonable. The so-called ladder principle should be applied, where you apply the least onerous condition, and then as needed, you ramp up, you go up the ladder. They must meet only 3 criteria: to ensure that you show up at court, to protect the security of victims and the community, in other words, to try and prevent the commission of future offences, and maintain public confidence in the administration of justice. Bail conditions, consequently, cannot be imposed in an attempt to shape a person's behaviour or to punish someone. But the reality is otherwise. Nearly all the bail cases in our survey, as I pointed out, had conditions, loads of conditions. Legal actors talked openly of using things like red zones as tools for rehabilitation, as tools to manage populations, criminal populations or presumed criminal populations. They talked about them as instruments of surveillance, as ways of surveilling populations to get around charter protections. It's a very good tool for the police to have. They talked about them as directed by the police. The police would tell them, we need to keep people away from Oppenheimer Park. So red zone people are away from Oppenheimer Park, for example. These sorts of things were frequent and common. Conditions of release, often numerous, were the default. So, what to do? This is my last slide. Well, when Marie-Ève and I and Celine were talking about, the last bit of the book, my first instinct was to kind of, because that's the way I go, was to say, okay, well, we need to think about prison abolition. We need to think about decriminalization. We need to think about, anti-poverty strategies. We need to think about the decriminalization of drugs. All these things make a lot of sense. But Marie-Ève actually encouraged me to think of something slightly more modest. So our modest solution or suggestion is that perhaps legal actors should conform to the prevailing law governing things like bail. We think the rule of law is, in this case, actually not a bad thing. So consequently, we suggest that unconditional release should be, as it is required, the norm. Doesn't mean you can't have conditions, but the default is unconditional release, and you go from there. Conditionals should be optional, rather than simply piled on. Red zones also should be the exception. There are cases in which red zones make sense, but not the norm, and they should not be applied in cases of addiction. That makes no sense at all. Conditions also, guess what, should be justified. They should be reasonable. They shouldn't be punitive. They shouldn't be attempts at rehabilitating people. So in severing people from localized resources and social networks and tying them to networks of legal force and legal surveillance, spatial conditions of release too often constitute a form of territorialized legal violence, rendering vulnerable people all the more precarious. They're also simply counterproductive, they manufacture crime, and they violate their own rules. We think we can do better. Thank you.
Should I put it in?
Yeah, that's what I did.
Is this working? Good. Hi, I'm Ann Livingston, just reminding you. I puzzled over what to say about conditions, because from where I work, conditions are really brutal, violent things that happen to people. So I thought I'd tell a story. Erika Thompson, who's not here, who's a great hero in the harm reduction movement, she's the president of the BC Yukon Association of Drug War Survivors, her and I had been called to testify at this coroner's inquiry into the death of Deanna Desjardins. And so it was, I just wanted to tell that story because the place was empty and the police weren't there, and her family couldn't make it because of illness. Like, it was a very bleak experience. So anyway, I just wanted to tell the story briefly because Deanna Desjardins is someone who has been arrested probably 100 times easily in her short life. But she is the way the story unravels is a much more clear illustration of the costs of these terrible conditions and this constant criminalization and then capturing a group of people who have no other option but to be rearrested. It's hard to describe just how futile and how much in their own minds they also know they will be rearrested. So she was killed in 2016, and my question at the beginning of this is to say, is she just another dead Native woman? And we, of course, have many, many Native women who have died in Canada. So I'm saying that the horrid policies denying marginalized people welfare for many reasons, continuously arresting people, what I call bullshit charges, so I guess that's administration of justice charges, that are killing people who die at the hands of predators, which is how she died. So, and it's an interesting connection because you don't immediately think that that could cause someone's death, having a warrant for their arrest. So and I think also we see this kind of a newly released population of people. If you want to ever see it, just ask me, I'll take you for a walk. Just before Christmas, they do this number of prisoners to guards ratio over the Christmas holidays. So you get this quite a large number of people released. Evidently, I don't know if I tried to get my friends here, but it's the day after welfare. So the real experts, I didn't get very many of them in the room tonight, but they don't tell you when you're getting out of jail for some reason. So they just kind of tell you the day you're leaving. And so anyway, they get released, and Christmas is cold and they don't see their families, and the family doesn't even know where they are, and then they get released usually to the downtown east side or the Surrey Strip. I think you get released to the same place you were picked up, which is a very interesting policy. And they often, what I'm saying about healthcare may not be true anymore, because I say they don't have healthcare. It was the policy that if you're on welfare, your MSP was covered, but the moment you get kicked off of welfare, your MSP is not covered, which means you're going to get a bill, these enormous bills wait for you should you ever, go on the straight and narrow and become an abstinent person and get a life. Then you got this massive debt sitting there. Anyway, I hope the NDP is straightening this out. They're cutting the MSP payments, so it won't be so terrible. But I don't know what they're going to do about the debts. So Deanna was in prison, and as far as I can tell, she was in there for a breach, and she was in remand, and she was released to a recovery house. So there's a kind of narrative when you're in one of these places that the way you can sort of speed your release up is to say that you're going to a recovery house because that's the basis of your criminality, is that you're an addict and you keep committing crime. And the woman testified, and she said that if she picks someone up at the prison, so they drive to the prison, pick her up, she's in the car, they're going to the recovery house in Surrey, and she says, and if I don't think they're serious about their recovery, I just leave them at a bus stop. And you've got to realize this is someone with not even ID on them often, with not necessarily clothing or backpacks or anything. And I thought, why is she saying this? My God, she should be ashamed of herself. Anyway, all of her records had been were missing, and she couldn't give them to the inquiry because they had been in a fire. And I thought, did you light that fire? Anyway, because recovery houses aren't necessarily very regulated, but it's enough to kind of wheedle your way out of prison by saying you're going to a recovery house. She lasted about 3 days in the recovery house, and then she ended up on 135A. But what's happened to Deanna is known as gating. That means that there was still a warrant for her arrest during her entire time that she was in jail. I don't know if you understand this. So you walk out of jail, and there's a cop there, and he re-releases you for a warrant. She didn't get gated at the gate, but it turned out it could have happened. So it's a kind of legal incompetence that exists. Evidently, if you're very clever at this and you've been through it a lot, you realize you've got all these charges and you get your lawyer to really be thorough and make sure that all of your warrants and charges and everything are all resolved before you head into prison. So I'm making the assumption that what had happened was she was picked up and held, or maybe let go a few times and then held, and then she saw the judge and he gives her the time served, but he might. So you get, I don't know if everyone's aware of this, once you're in there for long enough, you see the judge and he goes, oh, you've already been in jail for 2 months, why don't I sentence you to 2 months? Or he'll go, oh, that's not long enough, I'll give you an additional month. So then you get released. So you do see a judge eventually. And so her lawyer, okay, so I think there's a few incompetent lawyers out there. Erika was outraged that this had happened because Erika got sent. So she left the recovery house, and there's no support. She's like on the strip, and at this time all the tents were up, and I don't know, 135A in Surrey, everyone know this famous street? It's now completely empty, and they've put these careful little bricks in and new trees. I don't know, they're like paving bricks that must cost a fortune to put in, but anyway. She was staying at his place in Surrey because he likes to help the girls. So that, I think, is the predator. But anyway, so Erika drove up to this house and she could see the predator over there kind of lurking about, didn't come over and talk to her. She knew of this woman because she's HIV positive and Hep C positive. So you got to give credit to these hospitals who had kept track of her all through her prison because they're so worried about people taking part of their HIV meds and then we'll end up with a super bug for HIV. Is everyone following what I'm saying? So they knew where she was. So they called Erika, who was a completely underpaid outreach worker. So she drove over there. So what Erika discovered was that she had a warrant for her arrest. And I'll show you the little form. So I'm a famous welfare recipient. I'm finally not on welfare. But any outstanding warrants for your arrest, yes or no? If you say yes, they won't give you a check. They don't go and check. So I'm always telling people, just don't ever say you have a warrant. How the hell do you know if you have a warrant? As he's already pointed out, a lot of people don't know if they have warrants. So, and Deanna is a little bit kind of, Erika described her as being very pleasant, but she couldn't tell a lie. So she said yes. And she couldn't get a welfare check. So there she is, stuck with this predator in this house. It's Easter weekend, so what does that last from? Good Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And this is Thursday, and they're tearing around trying to get her on welfare. And Deanna then disappeared after this had happened. And that poster is the poster that her family made because they tried to report her. Anyway, I'll put that in the next slide because I'm just telling a story. So her family knew there was something wrong, and they reported her missing. But the police, both the VPD and the Surrey RCMP ignored them. They wouldn't take the report, and they wouldn't make a poster. And I think that's why the inquest got called. The family got so mad, they demanded a coroner's inquest. So they made their own missing posters and got them up because there are networks that do that. And then Erika was in her car. She picked up the phone. It was the RCMP. And they were telling her that she was transient. So if you ever hear someone's transient, that means there's not going to be a poster, they aren't going to put her on any list, and they're not going to look for her, which Erika knew. She knew this code word. So she was found 5 months later in Hawthorne Park in Surrey, so badly decomposed they couldn't determine the cause of death, although she was naked. And her family said she never goes into the woods by herself. She's scared of that kind of thing. She would not be there alone. So it was undetermined what her cause of death was. Clearly, in our minds, it was murder. So the other problem that we have that I think Nicholas was being so polite about is that the police make lucrative overtime pay for court appearances. So they're really incentivized to keep rearresting and charging people. And it's one of the things that's the most difficult thing to get at. So I spend my life trying to get data on the VPD, and it's very difficult to get. I say to them, for instance, how many warrants a week are you guys ending up causing? And they go, oh, we don't give out warrants. That's the court that do that. You know what I mean? And I know bloody well they know exactly how many warrants because they now pick up everyone. I didn't include a slide, but in the old days, if you were on a release, it was under corrections, and corrections would say, oh, Anne didn't show up at her, she's supposed to report. These are often a condition that you have to report to a probation officer, but you're not really on probation. It's just a condition that you have to report in. And if you miss the appointment, there's an immediate, now, there wasn't in the past, it was the probation officer, and then they might contact the police and say, could you pick her up? Because that's also a contempt of court charge. It's a criminal charge for missing that appointment. So now, for some reason, the police seem to know instantly that someone's missed their appointment. So, and of course, I was taught all this by the smartest people in the world, drug users. And, you know, Laura says to me, oh, shit, I didn't make my probation appointment. And I go, oh, well, I'll just call, you know, white middle class. Oh, I'll straighten this out. I'll do it on the phone. No problem. And she goes, Anne, they'll tell you to tell me to come in. And I said, no, really, there's got to be someone covering for this guy if he's on holiday. Yes, they said, tell her to come in. So I just said, just don't walk down any streets without me. I'll walk you to your place. I'll walk you back, because the cops don't arrest people around me. Anyway, just saying, it's a magic skill I have. So anyway, but it's really that abrupt and so much disregard. I mean, I wouldn't put up with that. You know, most people wouldn't, but they know they're defeated. So anyway, I'm just saying these are facts. If you, like for Laura, she knew that would happen, and there was no negotiating that was going to go on. So anyway, the other thing is, if you look at the number of missing women, so I have a sister-in-law who went missing in October of 1992, and I moved to the downtown east side in June of 1993, and these are my niece's mother. So it was a constant and upsetting problem as we tried to find her. So I started to get involved with all the families, you know, and there's really a large number of people that are missing, and they're women. And so I started to realize that they had warrants for their arrest. And if you know that someone has a warrant for their arrest, you know that they are dodging cops. It's never a good day to go down and go, oh, it's a warrant. Yeah, I thought I turned myself in. Like if you're addicted or using drugs in a kind of, you're gonna go through withdrawal. It's, like I said, it's just not really ever a good day. Although I just wanted to say we're gonna do a project, I'll describe the project at the end, where we're gonna start trying to do this from a grassroots approach, because there's been numerous reports, and yet there's been very little action on stopping this kind of arresting, rearresting. They call it churning. That's what Cowper calls it. I'm dying to meet that guy. Anyway, if you're really, really a nerd, you can go read this thing called the Cowper Report, C-O-W-P-E-R. It's like that thick. I'm sure me and 2 other people have read it. And then he has a Cowper Report update. So he did his report in 2012, and then there's a 2016 update, which basically says no one's done anything he asked them to do. So, but he doesn't seem very stern about it. Anyway, the other thing is that we think we have legal aid, but resolving a warrant doesn't count. So you can't just go to a lawyer. Like if you, there's other things you can get legal aid for, just saying, but this isn't one of them. So you really are trapped in this. So you're stuck with that legal problem. So as I just said, dozens of women I know are criminalized for petty crimes and even an unpaid bylaw ticket. So a few years back, the police decided that they would give out a lot of, it was 2008, and when I did the math later, I realized they figured they could arrest people for not paying the bylaw tickets just as the Olympics were starting, so that they could sort of clear out the neighborhood. I don't know. Anyway, we complained like hell at Van Duyn. We got 800 of the tickets reversed, so you want a ticket fixed, come to see Van Duyn. Just saying. But they were really obviously stupid, but it's true. If you don't pay a bylaw ticket, it takes a little while, and I think it's about 18 months to 2 years, but you will get a bench warrant, you know, ye old courthouse. I have no idea what the difference, you know, it seems like it's a pretty good warrant, just saying, it still works. And it's a charge of contempt of court, because what they've done is they've sent the fine to you a number of times, you still haven't paid it, and then they're going to punish you for not paying the fine. So they'll issue a bench warrant. And they send it somewhere, I'm not sure where, especially if you're homeless, where the thing has been sent to notify you, and then they'll initiate a warrant for your arrest. So anyway, you get them all the time. So in Diana Desjardins' inquest, the coroner made three of the recommendations: end the practice of denying income assistance benefits based on the existence of outstanding warrants. And I can assure you, that picture I took, I thought, this is my last welfare stub, I better take a picture. Because, people don't believe you when you tell them how bad welfare is, just saying. Because it's Canada and we have a social safety net. Just saying. And it's really, really hard for people to kind of let go of that. And you're going, no, it's gone. It's gone. I got bad news. Anyway, integrate access of income assistance benefits into release planning and correctional So she should not have been released without a welfare check or any kind of contact with that. Like when you see that she can't get it because of the warrant, and now she's vulnerable to a guy who likes to help the girls out. And even if that's a good relationship, it still sucks. And it's just so much against any kind of social safety net that we might imagine, in the sense that if you've done your crime and you've done the punishment, why wouldn't you be released on a sort of neutral basis, that if other people can get welfare, so can you. And then reduce incarceration rates for minor and administrative offenses through the expanded use of alternate sentencing approaches. And we haven't discussed that, whatever the hell that is. Often they use alternate sentencing approaches as more conditions of release that go on for longer. Like, it didn't work the first time, right? So now you read some of them from a larger place for not 1 year, but 2 years, and make them report more often. So these judges, like, you just think they got a screw loose. But, and I don't know how you educate judges. Evidently you can get in front of them and they take judge lessons somewhere, and you can do these little workshops with them and try to get them to kind of like quit being such unrealistic idiots and destroying people's lives. So the other thing is, most of the work that I've done on this has been about disease rates and health outcomes. And I think having any time in jail ever in your whole life, even once, is, if you're an epidemiologist, any epidemiologists here? If you do the data on that, you'll see that the, HIV rates are like triple, and the Hep C rates are like 8 times higher. You know what I mean? You start to get these snapshots of health outcomes, and they're absolutely miserable. So the disease spreading stuff was usually this is an old slide from they'll tell someone who's an actual alcoholic that they can't drink after condition of release. But there's, really? So it's a basic guarantee they're going to be rearrested, and not using drugs if they're addicted, not possessing paraphernalia, which of course spreads disease. There was a really excellent, if anyone wants any of this stuff, I have quite a few references. There's this excellent study in Australia, because Australia has a super low rate of HIV because they started drug user groups really, really early. But their Hep C rates are nuts. So they started thinking, why? Because it's spread, bloodborne, you don't get Hep C from sex. So HIV, it should be even higher for HIV, because everyone's boinking, like it's happening, and they're not using protection, that's my experience. But anyway, they started to say, why do we have these terrible Hep C rates? And in their quite a long study, they decided that it was these conditions of release and their kind of jail stuff, or even catching it right in jail, because there's no needles in jail and people are using drugs and they'll use the same syringe. So it's a pretty robust look at some of this, in case you guys think I'm making this up. Not being in certain areas where their family and friends live, and we've really gone through that already. So there's some release programs now. There's one that's out as the integrated services team. These are extremely expensive teams of people that get paid a whole bunch of money, and they're supposed to help people when they get out of jail for the first month. Well, I don't know if there's anyone else here who knows this. I'm in the welfare office and someone comes screaming in there with orange, actually it's not orange anymore. In BC, if you see someone in these light gray sweats and then shoes that shut with a Velcro, and they're white. So they're from prison. They used to do the orange suits here, but they got so many calls to 911 that they stopped using them. I'm not kidding. Because when you go to see that judge, if you've been sitting in remand long enough, you actually can walk out of the courtroom with no coat, no ID, nothing. Because people, and I used to say to them, well, why didn't you go back to the prison and get your ID and your coat? And they look at me like, are you fucking kidding? They just think you're mental. So which is probably true. It's better just to get the hell out of there. So I see that guy come in, and then there's this thing, they prorate the welfare. So if it's partway through the month, they couldn't possibly give you the full month. Wouldn't that be awful? And then they give you about 6 weeks. And if you're on ordinary welfare, within 6 weeks, you have to prove that you're looking for work. And it's a kind of a wild goose chase of a bunch of signatures to show that you showed up at these different programs. And if you don't do that, you're cut off. And if you're cut off, now you live in an alley. And, well, you did before, maybe. But the people who hire people right out of jail generally are drug dealers, and they hire them for the worst work, collecting debts, So it's violent and awful. So this is from a Georgia Straight article that Travis Lupick did this little series, and it was really very illustrative of this guy that he interviewed in this had been in jail for 10 years. And out of that, he'd never done anything. He'd never been sentenced for 10 years. He'd been in remand for 10 years, doing it at 3 months at a time. And the longest time he was ever out of jail was 6 weeks. So I think he took a law case, and I never heard of him again, so I'm pretty sure he won. Just, usually if you win the court case, they make you so you can't tell anyone what happened and how much money you got. So anyway, and they point this out, that once you're an inmate, once you're on the street, it's so complex to just your survival needs to go get, to go fill out a bunch of forms for income assistance or anything like that. So anyway, I just, and then I have this slide, but I thought all these were too old. Your stuff's really old too. I'm always struggling to, it's so hard to get data for arrests. It's a real interesting thing. For a while, the students were able to go and get the court things every day because they just throw them in recycling. And they're really nice to students, cops, just saying. So if anyone wants to help, I want your contact information. So we're trying to manufacture, I don't know if you can see this, the numbers are pretty small, but the green is probation, what they call probation. And this is British Columbia, community orders by supervision type. And I think I stole this out of, someone showed me how to screenshot, so the world's not safe anymore. Out of the Cowper report. So the Cowper report's got a lot of detail in it. And the red is bail, and then the blue is recognizance order, which is what? Is that just saying, I promise I'm going to show up, I give my... It just is, that's no conditions? Yeah, so look how few people get no conditions, the blue. So I think that's what the demand is, and the rest of these are viewed as being somewhat, illegal, as it's been pointed out. So anyway, so we've got this provincial drug user group going. We just got funded. But Erika, who has worked in Abbotsford for many years and really knows the system. She knows everything. Anyway, so she's experiential, as they say. She was taking women over to the courthouse and saying, we're here to change her conditions. And I've asked people about this, and they always say, oh, you need a lawyer. And I thought, well, lawyer, she didn't use a lawyer. So I think what we're going to be trying to do is a grassroots movement, because these reports are getting old. It's embarrassing to keep even referencing the Cowper report, because it's from 2012 or something, right? And there's been, the police now, if you ever go to the VPD, they're going to tell you that they don't do drug charges. They don't do drug charges. You go, can I get the data? And you can't. So you have to wait 18 months and get it from the federal government, who releases all BC's data. And lo and behold, there's Vancouver police drug charges. And you go, well, how did that happen if you don't do them? Like, this is the same thing they say they don't do prostitution charges. Anyway, how can you tell the police are lying? Their lips are moving. Anyway, it's not good. So it's a big struggle all the time. So what we thought, because we're these grassroots groups, and I mean grassroots, so if instead of saying to people, do you have a Narcan kit? Well, we could say that too. Do you have a Narcan kit? Do you have a condition of release? Or do you have any conditions? Because we're here to help. And then we learn how one person can take another person, like without having lawyers. I don't know, any lawyers here? Anyone who wants to help with this, we need someone to keep data, and then you'll write a brilliant paper and you'll be famous or published or something. So anyway, we are looking for that kind of help, but I think we need to get going with it. And I think what we're going to find is that each courthouse has its own little culture, and each police department has its own culture. So she was in Abbotsford, and they have the Abbotsford Police Department. Most of this province has this RCMP, which is, I've never heard it working well anywhere so far. New West has their own police. So you find this funny little patchwork of justice. And the police are key to it, because now a police officers with mandatory minimums, which you didn't cover, which is, I don't know, has anyone heard this nightmare about mandatory minimums? They have this, the judge can't decide what he's going to sentence you to. But if you think about it, you realize that the police officer can charge you with something that has a mandatory minimum. So who's sentencing you is the police officer. And he has discretion, believe it or not. Well, you can believe it. I mean, watching it. Well, don't get me going about the justice system. The Trump stuff and the thing. Also, right now, today, and I don't know if we're going to be able to hear it again, or someone knows how to clip it out, there was a really, really good thing on the CBC just before the news where they've got Harsha Walia, and they're talking about carding, which is not called carding here. We call it stop and search. No, we don't call it that. What do we call it? Just obvious harassment. So police are constantly going up to people and asking them for their ID. And if you just dress down, go on Hastings, you'll see what I mean. I'm just saying. They won't do it to me, unfortunately, but anyway. But they are really a problem, the police, just saying. Any police here? What I'm interested in what people are studying and what you guys have to say about this, so I'm kind of done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Nick. You can see how much we can learn when you have data and you have stories and you have someone who's on the ground really talking to people about what's going on. I want to open it up for questions now for both of these two. And we have, at least 20, 30 minutes. So please just raise your hand, and then Lori will come over and hand you a microphone to allow you to project to everyone. So, question? Okay.
I just have a question about how specifically the red zones conditions are, or generally the conditions came up with. Does a prosecution suggest to the judge specific conditions, or is it just completely judicial discretion?
So it's formally it's a negotiation. So you would have defense counsel who would speak to the accused person, and then they would have a conversation, and then there would be usually a kind of to and fro with prosecution. So then when you go before the court, you've come up with some sort of collective agreement, and the accused person is supposedly on side. That's, in theory, what happens. In reality, this is, of course, a woefully underfunded system, so people are processed at high rates of speed. So the reality is actually a little more fluid and chaotic, to be honest. And often this was clear in the people that we spoke to. So there were some very hard-working people in the courthouse, and defense counsel and prosecution and so on, who were working very hard, but they're working under very, very constrained conditions.
No, just that if you get picked up by the police, you're called detained. I don't know, your lawyering better be better than mine. And they'll let you go, and they'll give you conditions just to let you go. And yeah, I don't even know if you're charged, but police write them all the time, just saying.
That's police. Yeah, that's police bail. Yeah, so police can do that. They can't. It's not the same as court bail. It was also very, very clear, and this goes to Anne's point, that the police were actually driving this process, right? So that the courts were responding to police requests, responding to because they're the information managers, right, in this process, and so police play a crucial role in shaping this process, and as I said, identifying areas we want to keep people away from. So they're a crucial part of the story, which we weren't able to talk to, unfortunately.
Someone else?
Is this on?
Oh,
Is it my turn?
you have someone back there?
Hi, thank you both for your presentations. It was so interesting and disturbing. I have a question about whether you've noticed the digitization or automation of any of these processes. So when people are given, for example, conditions, when police are finding people, rearresting them, gating, and so on, there's some work in the US to suggest that this is becoming automated, and I'm wondering if you have noticed any of that, or if this is still paper-based transactions.
I haven't seen that. We didn't dig into that. I wouldn't be surprised if that is the case, because of course we're talking about lots and lots of people. Of course, as soon as you enter the criminal justice system, you become part of a sort of digital data trail that then becomes available to various players, the police included, in the system. I mean, one thing we did find, which was a sort of form of automation, was just actually the process of crafting the court order, the condition of release. This was a translation. One legal actor in Montreal described it like cutting a sandwich. You just cut the sandwich this way, this is the way I cut it. So it was kind of just routine. In other words, it's a routine sort of process. So it was, in terms of crafting what's supposed to be a tailored order. So it's sort of automated in that sense, that crafting process.
Yeah, I come across conditions of bail on the street. They were legal-sized papers. They were handwritten by police officers, and I haven't seen any recently, but we will certainly know that with our current project that we hope to get going. It's going to take some, we've got the funding. We just have to figure out how to do it.
Yes. Thank you for both presentations. And I had a question about the research that was presented first. We all know that racialized Indigenous people are mostly targeted the most when it comes to these issues. And I was wondering if you had such a big amount of data pool, and I'm sure it was so much to go through everything, of course. And I was wondering if you had done any racial analysis on it, or as well a gender analysis. We also know gender non-binary people are also targeted by police. So I was wondering if you got a chance to do that, and if not, if there's plans for that. I have a second question as well. Your recommendations, I think, as simple as they are, they're I think would get us a long way. And I was wondering if there are any plans, or have you already started any advocacy to get that? Like, what can we do to actually get that going beyond academia? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So the first question was a disappointment. We were not able to get data. So the criminal justice data set, it's called Justin. Ethnicity is self-reported. And so it proved just too unreliable to use.
Can you elaborate what do you mean by self-reported?
So people would say, I'm Aboriginal or whatever, and we looked at it and it proved unreliable. So people would sometimes say they'd identify differently at different times. It was hard to generalize. So you couldn't actually use that to sort of come up with something. The people who were doing the analysis, the statistical analysis, just said it was just wasn't really a strong basis for making the sorts of arguments we wanted to make. But as you point out, we know that people of colour are highly criminalised, and so it's going to be the case. This is going to fall heavily on racialized communities. So we know that to be the case. In terms of gender, we weren't able to get to non-binary folk. I know that the Vancouver database, for example, was predominantly male, young male, which is also something that you see in the criminal justice system more generally. So second point on recommendations, Marie-Ève is phenomenal on this. So because she's a dean of a law school, so she can mobilize those sorts of resources in all sorts of ways. So she's been involved. There has been actually some something called Bill C-75 that was at the federal level that was adopted, which is supposed to modify bail conditions to some extent, or to try and do some of the things we were pushing for. It didn't go far enough, but she was, and a lot of other criminal justice folk were involved in trying to push that. She's also actually been doing the kind of the judge school thing that Anne was talking about. So judges do go to school, they get like PD, pro D days, and and go to judge school and learn stuff. And so she's been doing phenomenal work, just trying to explain to these people, many of whom are well-intentioned or think they're doing the right thing, that in fact, you know what, maybe not so much. So that's actually very direct form of advocacy. But I think, if you're interested in lobbying the criminal justice system to maybe abide by its own rules, it's pretty much a slam dunk, you would assume. So, thanks. You want to go to that? Oh,
The other thing is that the police, I don't know if you're watching this, but the VPD came out with a report, and they did do race stuff, and it's obvious what they're doing, and it's horrible, and they should be called on it. And then BC Civil Liberties, it seems to have dropped, but I heard Harsha Walia on the radio just before I came here tonight. So there's been a bit of a thing about this, because, carding, or we don't call it that here. So what it is, carding, or stop and frisk, that stuff, is way disproportionately people of color. And we know in the prison, because people don't link them together. The police are in their own little silo, and the jails are in theirs, and the courts are in theirs, and the only people who really know all about the system are the people that they just, squeeze through this and torture with their... Anyway, so we know that 5% of the general population in Canada is black, and 9% of incarcerated federal facilities have black, so that's way disproportional. And then, of course, we've just had some more recent, everyone must have heard this on the news, so it used to be 35% of incarcerated women, but I think it's up into 40-something, almost half, or in some places it's way more. Anyway, you're exactly right. And it was weird because you see a lot more action on this in the States. So there's a program in Seattle called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. And what's happened there was that the American Civil Liberties went after the Seattle police, because it's like, 5% of the population's black, and then 53% of the arrests were black. Like, come on, you guys. So they just kept after them, and the police made this very limited, in one tiny area, they're not allowed to keep arresting the same people. And they divert them to a place where they're supposed to get help with their housing and their welfare and all that stuff. And they get infinite numbers of chances. And get this, they're allowed to have 3 grams of drugs on them for personal use. I'm just saying, it's kind of impressive. But I guess if you're not drug users, you don't think that's impressive.
Okay. So I have 2 questions. One is, I'm curious what the impact is in terms of what kind of police force a municipality has versus an RCMP or a municipal police force in the bigger picture. And then my second question is, regarding the data request that you have with the VPD, have you ever gone to the OIPC with a complaint, and what was the result of that? Thank you.
Oh.
So the first question was
Are most police municipal?
Sorry, the first question was is there a difference in terms of police forces? Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm...
Yeah, so just the implementation and the carrying out of charging criminals. So for instance, with Surrey right now, there was a huge campaign in changing over to a municipal police force. Do you actually see an impact with that change? And then the question is the OAPC, going to them for data.
So our focus was on Vancouver. But I think Anne is right to point out that there are different kind of criminal justice ecologies.
Yeah, a little bit.
Different places. I know, so Will Damon, my master's student, went on a road trip with Pivot.
Oh, right.
Was it Pivot, I think?
It was Pivot.
Where they went sort of around BC. And he had some really powerful stories about small towns in the interior. Where a red zone actually is racialized in the sense that this is where we keep the indigenous folk or indigenous folk away. So so this is presumably RCMP, but I don't. That's kind of anecdotal. I don't have more detailed stories there.
You're correct. I mean, most policing is local, and it's 12.2 billion, more than half the expenditures were allocated to municipal policing. A quarter of the federal policing was less than, you know what I mean? So provincial policing is very small. They have the OPP, so it can be very confusing to look at all these things, but almost all policing is municipal, which used to make my heart quicken. I'd think, good, we'll get a good city council in, and the mayor will chair the police board, and then we'll get changes. And one year, this is like a legend in, to me, Vancouver history, it was actually a right-wing government. They decided to reduce the police budget in Vancouver. And then they can't, evidently, because that's when the Attorney General steps in and they have some sort of formula for policing, and it's provincial. So they really catch citizens in a bad spot, because we think the police board's in charge of the police, and we think it is funded by municipal taxes, for sure. But the trick is that there's this sort of interference by the, is it the Attorney General? Yeah, or the Solicitor General. Solicitor General's in charge of police, Attorney General's in charge of courts. So it can be, it's very difficult to do the activism, just saying. It's confusing.
I just have to add one anecdotal story. I was teaching one of my undergraduate classes, and there was a student of the class who was really keen to join the VPD. He was a kind of, like these people that want to join motorcycle gangs, like, he was like, kind of like, what do you call those people? He was so keen. Yeah, so keen to join. So I taught red zones in the class, and he was fascinated, took notes, and then he went along and did a ride-along with a cop in the downtown east side, and he came back to me afterwards, and he said, so I was talking to my police officer friend, my mentor, and we were wondering, okay, so red zones are designed to exclude people. Couldn't we like just red zones so that we keep everyone inside the downtown east side? So it becomes and I said, well, that's what we call prison.
They did that in Surrey. 135A was an open-air prison.
Yeah.
Anyone found anywhere outside there, they would take them there, and then they would complain that they were there. It's sort of what they do with Oppenheimer Park.
Yeah.
Pivot said that.
Yeah, and red zones are a form of, they're an extension of the carceral, right? Prisons are not, carcerality is not just about prisons, right? It's about all these spaces that you can't go to, spaces you're confined to, spaces you have to reside at. So it's what scholars call the carceral continuum, right? This kind of loop in which people are constantly caught in these spaces of confinement and exclusion and control.
Thank you both for the excellent presentations. My question, I think, goes to you, Nick. It has to do with the broader context of the red zone. Beyond us here in Vancouver, or even Montreal in Canada, where else are they? When did they start? Do they all look like the kind we have here? Or do we have something, particularly pronounced? The downtown east side, in other respects across Canada, is a very concentrated spatial phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. That's a really interesting question. To some extent, we don't know because we haven't done the research. We were struggling to do Canada. We did some comparative work. So you do see, so in the US, for example, you'll find there's a wonderful book by Steve Herbert and Catherine Beckett called Banished, which talks about the use of kind of generic red zones. They're called soaps and sodas, stay out of areas of prostitution or stay out of drug areas. So people are released, and then everyone is excluded from those areas. So they're not personalized in the same sense. You certainly find in the UK, you find, or England, you find the use of exclusion zones, and they used to be called ASBOs and so on. So spatialized restrictions, right? So people who are deemed a bit disorderly are excluded from downtown areas for extended periods. So it's not uncommon. And we know in many other contexts the use of spatial regulations and spatial restrictions, right? You find it all throughout the criminal justice system. So panhandling, for example, which I looked at from some years ago, panhandling is legal except in designated spaces. So we use this is a way, of course, of getting around, things like rights, because we're just regulating spaces, we're not regulating people. There is a long history to this, and we have a chapter in the book where we talk about the history behind this, particularly in the English context. And actually, bail, for example, is like venerable. I mean, talk about oldie England. It's like pre-Norman. But what's interesting is that, and it's quite, you see things like peace bonds being used and so on. And what's clear is that these were used by people in authority to regulate people they deemed disorderly. What's also clear is that they were used to, not to advance the interests of those people governed by those restrictions, but rather to to govern, to sustain their own interests, to keep the peace. These sorts of things. Keep the peace really is, has it's connected to that. So there is a history to these things. Yeah, the U.S. more generally is different, as I said, in relation to bail. And one of the interesting things is when I've talked about this in the context of the U.S., reformers will say, well, we really want to get away with money bail and the bondsman and all these sorts of things because they really are, they're awful, and if you're poor, they're really awful. And so sometimes they look to Canada. They say, well, we should do like you guys are doing, right? You're trying to keep people out of jail, which is what bail is supposed to do, right? That's actually its origins in the Canadian context in the early 70s. And so maybe we should have red zones too. And I say, well, maybe not so good. Maybe, if you want to do that, be very cautious.
Yes, I wanted to go back to your chart of breaches. And as you had the chart up, I observed that the top two categories, which I think were orders and probation, are actually a summary of the rest of the chart because they're more specific. So you might want to look at that statistically. It's not quite.
I don't quite understand, I'm sorry.
Okay, the first two categories are very general.
Oh,
Orders and probation.
The first two categories are specific criminal code offences, so they're designated on the criminal code. And the first is a breach of a bail order. The second is a breach of a probation order. So
but as you go down the chart, they seem to be, to my eye, not being in your business, they seem to be subsets.
No, I don't think so, because the others are it's actually a statistically distinct category. So that was a government report. So the other categories are things like assault and so on. So they're different criminal code offences. So I don't see so I see them as discrete rather than those two as subsuming the others. I mean, we've got to be careful with our data. You're right to be cautious.
Yes.
Would you say that there is a correlation between the increase, so as we see the downtown east side, for example, becoming gentrified and areas being kind of, I guess, becoming exclusionary kind of economically in that sense, is there an increase in red zoning kind of prior to that, those kind of developments? Would you say those economic developments in certain areas? Would you say that it kind of becomes a tool almost of the kind of system in that sense?
Well, my instinct would be to say that there might be a connection. We don't have the data. I think they have been, we were looking at the last sort of 10 years, and so they've just been constant in places like the downtown east side. We know there are blitzes, right, as was pointed out, and the use of things like bylaw infractions to, quite possibly, those maybe have an association. And things like bylaw infractions actually have an association with breach, with conditions of release, because and there's some very interesting stats that Anne knows about. So what is it, like 92% of all panhandling, of all jaywalking tickets were in the downtown east side. Street vending, like phenomenal rates. So that could be a blitz, but it's also a means by which you can, so if you catch somebody jaywalking, you can run their record. And if you run your record, then you find out that they've got a condition, and then you can bust them and move them on. So, but I don't know of any specific correlation. I mean, Anne might have more personal experience of that.
Well, I think if you just put it bluntly, when I first moved to this neighborhood, and there was 10 police officers assigned to the downtown east side, and now there's something like 400. So, and you just think it's impossible, but I'm old. And it was 1993, and now it's, I'm just saying, but we've got the data on some of that very, very difficult stuff to get a hold of. And my illustration of it on a personal level is that I live 2 blocks from Main and Hastings at Four Sisters Housing Co-op, and have raised 4 children there, and then had a baby at 48, so he's 17 now. He's been picked up by the police twice. More than that, but twice when they reported me for child protection, that he should not be walking alone in this dangerous neighborhood. And I had a full child protection investigation. And you want to get me grouchy? Oh my God. But the problem was that I had already had all these other children, 3 other ones, all walking through the same neighborhood, to the same location, to the same school, through the same, and suddenly, you know, so I think it's just there's other, we're getting more and more police in terms of, the only thing I could find was police strength has increased in absolute and relative numbers. And I found these charts from, somebody made the mistake of putting these slides up. Police Services Division, they only go up to 2010, but it's a remarkable increase. And we're seeing also large numbers of remand centers being built. Yep. And it's kind of a warning, you know, if everyone's going to these demonstrations and stuff, they have enough cells to put everybody in. I'm just saying, it's a remarkable prison build, and it's for remand, not for keeping people incarcerated for sentences. People that get sentenced, for people, you know, I guess you guys might be like me, I didn't know anything about prison. If you're in remand, there's no programs. No. You just sit there. And often they even put the food under the door. You actually eat there alone. You might not see anyone unless you get this, they have to give you an hour or half an hour to go walk around somewhere. So, but if you're in real prison, you're sentenced and you're in a provincial place, so it's over 2 years you go to provincial, under 2 years you go to provincial, over 2 years you go to federal. And they actually have programs there. Like, you know, you get to do something and talk to each other. Actually, it's Laura. Laura demanded a sentence at one point because they were just too bidding her to death with these remand things. She said, she told the judge, you got to put me in somewhere where I can be in real jail. I can't take this anymore, because it's like being held in solitary confinement a lot of the time. But because, you know, remand was, you know what it was meant for? It was meant for people that were too dangerous to release. You know, the Bacon brothers, or I don't know, they're going to go shoot somebody. Like, you know what I mean? Like real serious stuff. So, but now everyone in remand shouldn't even be there. They didn't even commit a crime. If only we could find some crime.
Yeah, so there are more people, as I think I mentioned, in remand in BC than in prison. And also, so if you breach, something called the reverse onus provision applies. So basically, before you were presumed innocent, right, and you are to be released, but now because you have committed an offense, you have to, or your lawyer, has to make a compelling argument that you should be released. So the reverse now applies, right? You stay unless you can make a compelling reason why you should be released. And so this is what was also driving this churning, this phenomenal volume of people in detention for again, administration of justice offences, manufactured crime.
Yeah, it's
Okay, we'll do one more. Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentations. So I just have two questions. You started the presentation saying that it's really illegal, and then you in the middle you had mentioned that people were prevented from accessing medical and resources they need. So it sounds like it's not only illegal, it's also a human rights issue. Mm-hmm. Has there been a legal challenge against the court with regard to use of red zone? And the second question, I guess, is has anyone personally, through the court system, has personally challenged this as a human rights issue?
That's a really good question. There is a bit of jurisprudence around this, but essentially one of the surprising things that we discovered was that this whole kind of factory is pretty much a rights-free zone. People actually don't talk about rights. The legal actors we spoke to were kind of like, oh yeah, that's something we learned in law school. We don't talk about that here. And this is in part because it's like high volume, high intensity. There are other factors as well. So people who are detained and are in remand, they don't want to have necessarily a conversation about their rights. They just want to get out of there, right? And so, keeping me in remand while we discuss my constitutional rights is not something people seem to understandably want to engage with.
Which is why we're trying to design our project so that we don't, like if you want to argue with the judge about being released, you're actually in withdrawal usually. You know what I mean? They could say anything and you'll agree to it to get the hell out, which is what we would encourage people to do, get the hell out, and then maybe we can go back in and negotiate a change to the conditions of release. But I think that's one of the hopes of our project is I don't know if you know what it's like to try and do a court case. You have to find someone who's had this happen to them, which means that they're super marginalized. The welfare system and the housing people, nothing's going to support them. So you basically have to put them on your couch and keep them alive so that they can work their way through an extremely long process. And then you can do a class action. You know, Ann Livingston and everyone else affected by the same thing she's affected by. We did a methadone, the British Columbia Association of People on Methadone took a court case, and it was a real lesson in, well, finding a lawyer who was smart about it, and it's very administrative law. It's not what people go to law school for, evidently. And to have the case heard, and they won, and they got $5.1 million that had to be distributed back to people on welfare because they were illegally removing part of their welfare check and sending it to a for-profit clinic. And it was clearly just theft. And so evidently we had such good evidence they didn't even argue. Then they just negotiated the amount. So it was just mailed back to people on the 15th of each month if you were, anyway, I met people, they wept. They said, no one's ever done anything for me in my whole life ever. And they are very defeated. But you know what I'm just saying. It's possible. It's just really tough. You want to help? It sounds like you have a really good idea. Just saying. I don't know if it's working now.
So thank you, Anne and Nick, for super provocative presentations. And thank you to the audience for your excellent questions that elicited so much more richness. I hope you found this valuable this evening. And I just have a couple of things to say before I turn you loose. One is that we'd like to thank our sponsors, the SFU David and Cecilia Ting Endowment for Public Education and the SFU Alumni Association. There's one more talk in the series here, and the next one will be on March 12th, Navigating Towards Ecologically Safe and Socially Just Fisheries, featuring Anne Solomon, a resource and environmental management professor at SFU. So if you missed any of the previous talks, they are available on our website. Good night, everyone.